When I was told I was going to win a porn award, people were saying, oh, it's going to look like a penis. That's what they said. And then I got this. I suppose I first became aware of Mary Millington when I was actually quite a small boy. I grew up in Gloucestershire, and in the city of Gloucester, there's a central square, King Square, which when you were a child was the coolest place to hang out because it had water there, it had fountains, it had stepping stones, ice cream sellers. And when you went there, it really felt like you were at a holiday park, at Butlins or something, even though it was in the centre of a city. And on the square was an old cinema. Originally it was the Regal, then it was the ABC. And I think that's where I saw Superman 1 or 2 when I was a kid. But like all provincial cinemas, they also played X-rated films, porn films, sex comedies. And I remember walking through King Square when I was a small boy with my mother, I think my grandmother as well, and I saw this poster outside the ABC cinema for a Mary Millington film. And it was Confessions from the David Galaxy Affair. And I remember this poster vividly because it has an image of Mary, not wearing very many clothes, looking very provocative, stood there with Alan Lake. And I didn't know who Mary Millington was or who Alan Lake was, but I was so transfixed by this image. And I knew this wasn't Superman. This was not a film for kids. This was a film for grown-ups. And I also noticed there were names on the poster. Diana Dawes' name was on the poster and Bernie Winters. And I knew them because I used to watch Celebrity Squares on a Saturday night with Bob Monkhouse. And I couldn't understand in my head why they were appearing in a film for grown-ups. And I could tell this film was rude. It was not for children. So that's my first ever memory as a very small boy of seeing what Mary Millington looked like or seeing her name on something that was printed. I suppose out of all Mary Millington's films, my favourite is 1978's The Playbirds, because it is the ultimate exploitation film. It has murders in it, it has some violence, it has sex, it even has some witchcraft in it as well. And at the centre of it, you have Mary Millington dressed as a police officer, walking through Soho. So for me, that is the best. And I think she probably also gave her best performance in that film. In the late 90s, I'd been working for a newspaper, but I wanted to write a book. I didn't want to work for a newspaper anymore, and I really wanted to write something about Mary Millington. So I did a proposal for a book about her life, and Fab Press, who was a publisher's down in Surrey, they gave me my first opportunity to write something. So I wrote a biography about her, and it was quite exciting for me because I'd never done anything like that before. And I got to meet her family. I got to meet David Sullivan, who was her ex-partner, for the very first time. And that came out in the summer, I think, of 1999. And everything just came from that, really, me making a film and working on other books. So that was the first time I ever put pen to paper, writing about Mary. I met some quite interesting characters during my research for my Mary Millington book. Probably the worst person I met, really, was a guy called John East, who had been Mary's publicist, and he was her voice coach. And he was a very sleazy individual. I remember that I met him for the very first time at BBC Broadcasting House. I'm not entirely sure what he was doing there, to be honest, but we had our first interview in the canteen at BBC Broadcasting House. Everybody knew him, but he was a really annoying character, and he had awful stories about celebrities. He knew the sleaziest details about every celebrity he'd ever met. And he wasn't very happy with my book in the end after it came out, because he felt that I'd portrayed him in a very negative light. But he really was an awful person, one of the worst people I've ever met in my life. And I don't know how I could have written it in a different way. I mean, he was very disagreeable. He treated Mary just terribly. So I wrote it as I saw it, but he was not happy about the book when it came out. A couple of years after I wrote my Mary Millington biography, I wrote another book about X-rated British films. It was called Keeping the British End Up. So this was a complete anthology of every British sex film that had ever been made in like a period of 25 years, from the late 50s to the early 1980s. And I met some really interesting people while writing that book. Probably the most influential for me was a guy called Stanley Long, who was like the king of exploitation films. There's nothing about low-budget films he didn't know about. And we were friends for about 12 years. We were very, very close. And I guess he was my mentor as well. I think I probably have learnt more about filmmaking from him than anybody else. And in fact, when we were first introduced, I had no idea I was going to be a filmmaker. I just liked him, and we talked an awful lot, and I interviewed him for various projects. But he was an expert in filmmaking in every aspect. You know, he was a writer, a director, a producer, and he's also been a distributor. So he knew every side of the business, and he knew how to make a film very cheaply. So I think anything that I do in my life as a filmmaker, I've learnt from Stanley. You know, he was very prudent. He knew about finding the right location, working with the best people in front of the camera and behind the camera. He really knew what he was doing. And the thing I remember him saying most of all was, you need to be the first person on set every day. It's all about being organised. And he was a very organised filmmaker, and I like to think that has rubbed off on me, that I'm quite organised in my approach to making films. Stanley was also an advocate of guerrilla filmmaking. He used to talk about this a lot. You know, if there's a particular location you want to go to and film, but you have no permission to film there, it doesn't matter. You just go there with your cameraman, you take the shot, and then you run, you scarper. And he told me about this, and that's something I've learned. And I've pretty much everything I've ever filmed subsequently, I've done it with that in mind. If I haven't got a permit, then it doesn't matter. I just go and film. So I learned everything I know pretty much from him. And sadly, he died quite a few years ago now. But I dedicated my first film, Respectable, to him as a tribute, because I would have been hugely proud if he'd been around to see that film released. In the years after I wrote my first book about Mary Millington, I was actually approached by quite a few producers who wanted to turn it into a movie. Quite ridiculous situations happened. An American producer, he wanted to shoot the film completely in America, and he wanted Reese Witherspoon to play Mary, which was just absolutely insane. And another American producer wanted to turn my book into a hardcore porn movie. He said we couldn't possibly tell Mary's life without having it as a hardcore porno, and which I just didn't understand. You know, I said, if we were making a film about Princess Diana, would we actually have to have somebody dying at the end in a car crash? He just didn't understand it. So that didn't happen, obviously. And then a few years ago as well, it was probably the most exciting thing, it didn't happen. But the director, Sam Mendes, contacted me, his production company, and they were looking at making a film about Mary's life. I mean, it may still happen, a narrative drama about her life. But in the end, we ended up making a full-length documentary, which was the film that I made. In about 2011, I was approached by a film producer called Keith Evans, who had an idea to make a film about Mary Millington, and that was the documentary that I ended up doing. Originally, when we started the film, I was hired as an associate producer and a writer. It was based on my book, and I was going to be doing all the interviews, and somebody else was going to be directing the film, but for one reason or another, he didn't end up doing it. So the film didn't have anyone to direct it. So I said to Keith Evans, the producer, the executive producer, would you let me do it? And he said yes, straight away. We didn't even have a conversation of any length about this. He said yes. So that's how I ended up directing my first film. It was quite by accident. Mary Millington always joked that she was born respectable, but that wasn't going to ruin her life, which I thought was a great quote. So we thought we'd call the movie Respectable because it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. If you're making a film about a porn star in the 1970s, calling it Respectable is funny. So that was the only title I ever came up with for the film, and I'm really glad we used it. I don't think I was especially daunted at making my first film. I was writing, I was directing, I was producing, so there was a lot of things, a lot of bases to cover. But I don't think I was daunted. I think I was excited. And probably the most exciting thing was that we were filming and editing at Pinewood Studios, which was a dream come true for me. Pinewood is a really interesting place. I mean, when you get there, it looks like a lot of aircraft hangars, really big studios. It looks like an industrial park almost. But the fun thing is, when those doors of those big buildings open, you just see magic behind them, and that's the exciting bit. So while I was there, I bumped into quite a few interesting people. I mean, when we were shooting Respectable, my movie, they were also making Star Wars Episode 7. And I'm a big Star Wars fan. So that was wonderful for me to see stormtroopers walking around. I mean, there was one day we were editing quite an explicit part of my film. And these guys, dressed as stormtroopers in full costume, were walking past my little studio and were watching what we were doing. And all the helmets came off, and they were looking at us and giggling, laughing about what we were doing. So making my film next door to the Star Wars movie, that was a big thrill for me. But you do bump into some amazing people when you're at Pinewood. I remember one day bumping into Pierce Brosnan, another day Angelina Jolie, because I think she was filming Maleficent. But there were some random things as well. The canteen at Pinewood Studios was a great place to meet people. And I remember on one particular day, probably the most unusual thing that happened to me was I was sitting at a table and Bobby Davro, the English comedian, was sitting next to me. I don't know what he was doing at Pinewood. And he said to me, "Oh, what are you filming?" And I said, "Oh, I'm making a documentary about Mary Millington." And he looked very animated, his eyes lit up, and he said, "Oh, yes, Mary Millington, she was my first wank," which was quite a shock. The whole table went quiet. As well as filming at Pinewood Studios, we did a lot of location shoots. And I suppose the strangest thing that happened when we were filming, we were in South London in Norbury. And Norbury is where Mary Millington had her sex shop. It's no longer a sex shop, it's something else now, another business. We pulled up outside Mary Millington's old sex shop to do some filming. And we put on the radio. And Mary Millington's favourite singer was an English singer-songwriter called Labby Sifry. He's most famous for a song called It Must Be Love. And the moment we arrived outside Mary Millington's sex shop, turned on the radio, and Labby Sifry came on the radio. Now, he's not played an awful lot on British radio anymore, so that was quite a surprising moment. And we all went quiet, and we were kind of thinking, well, Mary is here somewhere. She's watching us doing this filming. She knows what we're up to. But it was a bit spooky, but we rather liked it. The opening sequence of Respectable, we tried to make it look like a 1970s sex cinema in Soho. So we had it all set up in the studio with the projector, and the film is playing on a screen. It's very dark, but the shot just wasn't working. So, because it wasn't smoky enough, because in the 1970s, everybody smoked in a cinema. So we had to get some smoke. And in the particular studio I was working in, we weren't allowed to smoke, but I'm afraid we broke the rules. So Jim Groom, who was my partner in crime, he was the editor on the film, we got him to lie on the floor, and he was smoking cigar after cigar after cigar, and then blowing the smoke into the air to give the desired effect of a smoky 1970s porn cinema. And it looks really good on camera. It's one of my favourite shots right at the beginning of the movie. But he was coughing and spluttering, and we thought we were going to kill him because he was having to smoke so many cigars to get that shot. So I'll always be grateful for him for doing that. I worked with some really interesting people during the making of Respectable, and even though the film was only made relatively few years ago, quite a few of those interviewees have already passed away, which is incredible. Dudley Sutton was in the film, who was an amazing guy, very, very funny. Trevor Crook, who was Mary's one-time boyfriend. It was the first and only interview he'd ever done about her. Dave Cash, the DJ, he passed away about 6 months after the film premiered, and everyone had told me that he would never speak about Mary, but he did, and he was brilliant. I mean, I couldn't really have made that film today without people like David Sullivan and Trevor Crook and Dave Cash in it, because they all had a romantic involvement with Mary, so they were able to give her story greater depth. So if I was going to make a Mary Millington documentary today, I don't think I could really do it, because those three guys were key to it. Dudley Sutton was a really funny guy. He's a very principled man, very political, but he was also quite naughty. One of my favourite bits in the whole film is when he talks about Mary Whitehouse and about how she needed to be getting more sex. We were all in hysterics that day when he was talking about that. But he was also quite naughty off camera as well. I remember he came to visit me in Gloucestershire a few years ago before he died, and we went to a pub, we went for a meal, and he talked very, very loudly. And he talked loudly because he wanted people to hear what he was talking about. And Dudley was bisexual, and he told me a story, it was like a sexual story about him and Dirk Bogarde. And he was going into great detail about what him and Dirk Bogarde got up to. And the whole of the pub went quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. But he wanted people to hear. I was a little bit embarrassed because he was going into, very intimate details. But he loved it. He loved playing to an audience because he was quite a naughty old guy. So I got to interview Jason Lake, who was Diana Dors and Alan Lake's only son together. And he was, without doubt, one of the most fragile characters I've ever met, a very damaged individual. He was incredibly nervous on camera. And the day we were filming him, he was taking cocaine to calm his nerves, but it actually made him, quite wild that day. And you can see it on camera. He was so like his father. But he was a similar age to me, and I really felt sorry for Jason because he had a really terrible childhood. His dad was just reckless, crazy guy, Alan Lake, and he was doing drugs with his son when Jason was about 8 years of age, which was just absolutely appalling, and they'd watch porn films together. And he said he had a very, very unusual childhood. But what made me angry about it, Jason Lake adored his mother, Diana Dors, but she just stood by and let this happen. She thought it was funny. All of these things were happening to her son. And I think in hindsight, people look at Diana Dors and they think, oh, she was this cuddly, mumsy, family entertainer on British TV. But I think there was a real dark side to Diana Dors as well. And I'm not entirely sure she was that nice a person. I think she certainly took advantage of Mary Millington a lot in Mary's life. And she was like a Svengali character, a Svengali figure for Mary. And Mary looked up to her, but she really took advantage of Mary. And she'd be around all the time, organising sex parties at her house. And Mary would have to do terrible things. And so I think the historical view people have of Diana Dors isn't quite accurate. I think she was quite an unpleasant lady when she needed to be, quite ruthless. Pretty much everybody I wanted to be in the film I got. There were a couple of people who didn't want to appear. Rosemary England, who was another model and porn star from the late 70s, who worked with Mary on a couple of projects. I really wanted her to be in the film because she's still amazing looking. She was relatively young when she was making films with Mary. She was like 10 years younger than Mary. So she still looks fantastic. But I went down to her house on the south coast of England and asked her to do the film, and she wouldn't do it. So that was a big disappointment because I think she would have been fantastic in front of the camera. And lots of people asked me about Rosemary England, what happened to her. And I think people would have liked to have seen what she looks like now because she's still amazing. There were a couple of other celebrities we asked, big names. I mean, Freddie Starr we asked to be in the movie. I mean, he knew a lot about what was going on in Diana Dors and Alan Lake's house with Mary Millington in the 70s, but he point blank refused. He knew a lot of stuff that was going on, but he wouldn't do the film. And probably the most unusual person that we asked, and I knew he would say no, was Bruce Forsyth, because I'd heard stories about Bruce and Mary and how they'd known each other and how they'd met. And I wanted to find out more about that. But of course, he was still a big star. He was still presenting Saturday Night TV with Strictly Come Dancing, and he said no, he wouldn't do it. But it would have been a real coup to get Bruce in my film, but it wasn't to be. When the film was released, I got some really good reviews. I was very grateful for that. But there was one critic who said that I'd added a conspiracy theory to the end of the film with relation to the circumstances of Mary's death. But the truth of the matter is, at least 40% of the people I interviewed for the film expressed a very similar opinion, that they didn't believe that Mary had taken her own life, that she had not been a willing participant in that last night of her life. Mary took a vast amount of pills and vodka the night she died. And we can't argue with the fact she did write those notes the night she died. But there is some debate about who else was in the house that night, who might have been persuading her to do those things. There were three other people in the house that night, one of whom was Trevor Crook, who I interviewed in the film. And Trevor was quite explicit about what he thought had gone on that night. There was somebody else in the house that I didn't talk about in the movie for legal reasons. I couldn't. But I don't think the established narrative of Mary's death is accurate. Other things were going on. David Sullivan always said to me, Mary had two dogs who she absolutely doted on. And he said there's no way on earth that she would have killed herself having left those dogs, because she treated them like children. She was absolutely devoted to these dogs. And Jason Lake told me that his parents were convinced, Dinah Dawes and Alan Lake, they were convinced that foul play was involved that night. And one of Mary's school friends, she was very explicit, used very strong language about what she'd heard that had gone on that night, because people had been talking about it. And we didn't use her interview in the finished film because it was just far too explosive, the things she was saying. So I had to be quite careful about what we actually said in the movie. But it was more complicated than people actually know. I think it's just very sad that at the age of 33 she died. She could still be around now in her 70s, still having a whale of a time, probably running an animal sanctuary, with dogs and donkeys and geese and chickens. She would have loved that. So just the tragedy of it is she died so young, but I don't think she really planned that. I think there were other factors involved. And plenty of people have said to me that the police were involved. They were complicit in it as well. So I had to tread quite carefully in telling that bit in the film. But I let the audience make up their own mind about what they thought. So it was my first film, Respectable, and it was quite terrifying releasing it and to the public and seeing what they thought. But I was very lucky. I had a West End premiere at the Regent Street Cinema in London near BBC Broadcasting House, and that was a huge thrill. It was a red carpet event, all these people in the film, lots of porn stars there. It was quite nerve-wracking for me because I had to present the film on stage, but it was a night I'll never forget. And the day after, the film went on Netflix, which, for a guy in his 40s, their first film to go straight onto Netflix, I couldn't quite believe it. And Netflix loved the film. They didn't ask for any cuts. I was absolutely amazed. I thought they'd want to pixelate some bits of the film, but they didn't. So that played all over the world. So I brought Mary to a worldwide audience. I didn't know I was going to, but that was hugely exciting for me. The film is quite explicit in parts, and the British Board of Film Classification, somebody there said to me they considered it to be the most explicit 18 certificate documentary they'd ever passed. So I was very proud about that I'd made a really dirty movie, and it ended up on Netflix, so that was great. In conjunction with the release of the film in April 2016, we also unveiled a blue plaque in Great Wimble Street in Soho, and this was to commemorate Mary's role in Come Play With Me and the fact that the movie played in the West End for 201 continuous weeks. It still holds the record for the longest running British movie of all time. So we got this blue plaque made to be erected on the front of the old Moulin Cinema, which is now a restaurant. And the blue plaque, it wasn't an English heritage blue plaque, but the historian, the chief historian from English Heritage, he advised us on the plaque, on the colour, on the wording, stuff like that. And then we erected it. And it caused such a lot of fuss. The Sun newspaper gave us a double-page spread the day it was unveiled, and their headline was something along the lines of, English Heritage have unveiled a plaque to a porn star. And English Heritage went fucking crazy about this because it really didn't have anything to do with English Heritage. They advised us on it, but they didn't pay for it. So English Heritage, I remember the day the film was released, English Heritage were ringing me up on my mobile phone when I really didn't want this to be happening. I had a lot to do, saying, you've got to make the Sun take the story off their website. And it was nothing to do with me. It was what the Sun wanted to say. So they were furious about it. But it wasn't my fault. It was how it was reported. And then it went on all the other websites. So the Daily Mail reported it. And something I was really proud about was, the Daily Mail did a news story, and it said, English Heritage are now doing blue plaques for porn stars. So there were all these comments from furious Daily Mail readers at the bottom saying, this is a disgrace. What has the country come to? Now we're honouring porn stars. This is disgusting. So I was hugely proud of that because I really liked pissing off Daily Mail readers. So that was a good part of the day in the end. I always said I'd never make another feature-length documentary because it was hard work making the first one. It was really stressful. But I have made another film called Everything, and it's the story of The Real Thing, the 1970s soul and funk band from Liverpool. And it has a similar kind of narrative to Mary's story. There's tragedy in it as somebody who died very young. There's cocaine addiction in it as well. There's the story of how people came from nothing and then became massive stars. So it's got a similar kind of feel to Mary's story. It's set mainly in the 1970s as well, which I think is such a fertile ground for me. I think I'll always go back to the 1970s, probably if I'm making films in the future. So I want to carry on making movies. And I really hope people love the next film as well. I get asked quite a lot, did you meet Mary Millington? And obviously I didn't, because I was a small boy when she died. And I was living in the West Country and she was having this amazing porn star life in London and Surrey. So our paths never crossed. But through my research into her life and writing books about her and meeting her family and making friends with the people she used to know, and they're now part of my social circle, and making the movie, I feel like I do know her in many respects. And I'm very lucky to be in that position. And I don't think I would have become a writer if it hadn't been for Mary Millington. I would have never made a film if it hadn't been for Mary Millington. So even though I never met her and never knew her really, I think I owe her a lot. I don't think I would be in the position as a filmmaker now if it hadn't been for Mary Millington. So I thank her very, very much for what she's done for me.